His name should have been remembered with the greats. He was the grandson of Solomon, the great-grandson of David. He had royal blood, the throne of Judah, and the legacy of his ancestors behind him. But instead of building a lasting kingdom, his reign was cut short just 3 years. Abijah inherited a broken kingdom from his father, Rehoboam. Judah was weak, divided, and constantly at war with the northern kingdom of Israel. And at the center of it all was Jeroboam, the man who had stolen 10 tribes and declared himself king. The two rulers clashed in a war that should have destroyed Judah. Outnumbered 2-1, standing against an enemy far stronger, Abijah should have lost. But what happened next was a battle unlike anything Judah had ever seen. Yet for all his victories, Abijah was not a king fully devoted to God. He followed in the sins of his father, repeating the same mistakes that had weakened Judah in the first place. His story is a warning, a leader who had everything but never reached his full potential. Like and share this deep Bible stories video, and let's uncover the forgotten king, Abijah, like never before. Now let's dive in. Abijah was born into chaos. His father, Rehoboam, had inherited a kingdom once united, powerful, and blessed, but had shattered it in a matter of days. What had once been the mighty kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon was now a divided and broken land. The northern tribes had torn away following a rebellious leader named Jeroboam and forming the kingdom of Israel. Judah, the once proud throne of David, was left as a weakened remnant struggling to hold itself together. And this was the kingdom Abijah was born into. He was not the son of a victorious, God-fearing king. He was the son of failure. Rehoboam, his father, had been arrogant, foolish, and weak. When the people pleaded for mercy, he gave them cruelty. When wise counsel warned him, he rejected it. And when Israel rebelled, he did nothing to win them back. Judah was left battered, humiliated, and vulnerable to attack. And so Abijah grew up in a kingdom overshadowed by its past glories and present failures. His great-grandfather David had been a warrior king, a man after God's own heart. His grandfather Solomon had been the wisest man to ever live, building a golden empire. But his father had destroyed everything in just a few reckless moments. It wasn't just the kingdom that was divided. Faith itself was crumbling. While Judah still held the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, the people had begun to turn to idols. Pagan altars rose across the land. Rehoboam, instead of standing strong in the ways of God, allowed corruption to spread. And Abijah, he was watching. He was learning. Did he see his father's weakness and vow to be stronger? Did he look at the broken kingdom and dream of restoring it? Or did he simply accept that this was how things would always be? Judah, broken. Israel, lost. War, inevitable. One thing is certain, Abijah was raised for battle. From the moment he was born, his kingdom was at war with Israel. The two nations, once brothers, were now bitter enemies. Abijah grew up hearing the clashing of swords, the war cries of soldiers, and the endless threats from the north. He was not raised in the peace and prosperity of Solomon's golden age. He was raised in a kingdom constantly on the brink of destruction. And then one day, his father died. Rehoboam's reign had come to an end, and the crown passed to Abijah. He had seen the failures of his father. He had watched as Jeroboam ruled over the stolen kingdom of Israel, and now it was his turn to rule. Would he be different? Would he fight to restore what had been lost? Or would he fall into the same traps that had weakened his father? Judah had a new king, but the question remained, would he be the king they needed? The battle for the throne had just begun. Abijah had barely taken the throne before war came knocking. The kingdom of Judah was still reeling from his father's failures, and across the border, Jeroboam, the king of Israel, saw an opportunity. 4 years, Jeroboam had ruled over the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes that had rebelled against Rehoboam. He had built his own altars, his own priesthood, his own system of worship. He had filled his kingdom with golden calves, leading Israel deeper into idolatry. And now, with Rehoboam dead and a new, inexperienced king on Judah's throne, he decided it was time to strike. This wasn't just a political war. This was a war for the soul of Israel. Abijah stood on Mount Simaraim, high above the battlefield. Below, 2 armies had gathered for war, Judah on one side, Israel on the other. But there was one problem. Judah was outnumbered 2-1. Abijah had 400,000 soldiers, a strong army, but nothing compared to what Jeroboam had brought against him. Yet to Lakham Mani Dargal, a force so large that Judah's warriors must have felt hopeless before the battle even began. It wasn't just a battle. It was a massacre waiting to happen. And yet Abijah did something unexpected. Instead of preparing for battle, he spoke. Before the first sword was drawn, before the first arrows flew, Abijah stood on the mountain and shouted across the battlefield. He wasn't speaking to his own men. He was speaking to Jeroboam's army. Do you not know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of Israel to David and his descendants forever? He called out. 2 Chronicles 13:5. This was more than just a speech. This was a warning. Abijah reminded them that God had made an everlasting covenant with the house of David, that Judah had the rightful king, the rightful priests, and the rightful place of worship. Then his voice turned sharp. But you, Jeroboam, he declared, are nothing but a servant who rebelled against your master Solomon. He didn't just challenge Israel. He humiliated Jeroboam in front of his entire army. But he wasn't done. You have driven out the priests of the Lord, he accused, and made your own priests just like the pagans. He called out Israel's idolatry, its rebellion, and its sin. He made it clear that Judah was still standing with God while Israel had turned its back on him. And then, in one final defiant statement, Abijah declared victory before the battle had even begun. God is with us. He is our leader. Do not fight against the Lord, the God of your ancestors, for you will not succeed. 2 Chronicles 13:12. It was bold, it was reckless, and it would have been laughable if God wasn't listening. But Jeroboam wasn't shaken. He wasn't about to back down because of a speech. While Abijah was speaking, Jeroboam had already set a trap. Unbeknownst to Judah's army, Israelite troops were moving behind them. Before they even realized it, Abijah's forces were surrounded. The 400,000 warriors of Judah were trapped. The 800,000 soldiers of Israel were closing in. It was over. There was no escape, no strategy that could save them. The trap had been set, and Judah had walked right into it. But then something happened. With nowhere left to turn, the warriors of Judah did the only thing they could. They cried out to the Lord. It wasn't just a prayer. It was a battle cry, a desperate, faith-filled roar that shook the heavens. And the priests, they lifted their trumpets and blew. The sound echoed across the battlefield, the sound of faith, the sound of defiance, the sound of a nation that refused to give up. And in that moment, God stepped in. God struck Jeroboam's army with panic. The warriors of Israel, the ones who had surrounded Judah, the ones who were certain they had already won, were suddenly thrown into confusion. And Judah, they seized the moment. Abijah and his army charged forward, cutting down their enemies with supernatural strength. What should have been their defeat became their greatest victory. By the time the battle was over, Judah had slain 500,000 of Israel's warriors. More than half of Jeroboam's army was gone. It was one of the most lopsided victories in history. Jeroboam, humiliated, never recovered from this defeat. Abijah, for a brief moment, proved that Judah still had power, that the house of David still had divine favor. But here's the tragic part. It didn't last. This should have been the moment where Abijah turned back to God completely, where he led a revival, where he restored Judah to faithfulness. Instead, he followed the same path as his father. He won the battle, but he didn't win the war, because a kingdom isn't saved by just one victory. It's saved by faithfulness. Then Abijah, he didn't stay faithful. Abijah's story is a reminder that God can give us victory, even when the odds are against us. But victory means nothing if we don't stay close to Him afterward. We can call on God in battle, but do we stay with Him after the war is won? Abijah showed us what faith in a crisis looks like, but his failure shows us that faith must be constant, not just in moments of desperation. And that's where his story takes a turn, because while he won the greatest battle of his life, he lost the war for his soul. The battlefield was silent for only a moment. The dust hung thick in the air, and the smell of sweat and fear clung to the warriors like a second skin. 400,000 men of Judah stood facing the impossible. Across from them, 800,000 warriors from Israel, a wall of iron and flesh led by a king who had already defied God. Abijah stood tall, looking out over his men. He knew the truth. This was not just about land, power, or thrones. This was about God's covenant. But even as his words rang across the battlefield, reminding Israel of their rebellion, of the promises they had abandoned, something sinister was happening. Jeroboam, king of Israel, had already set his trap. The armies of Judah had no idea that an ambush was closing in behind them. By the time they realized, it was too late. The sound of marching filled the air. The warriors of Judah turned, and their faces paled. They were surrounded. Jeroboam had done what no commander in his right mind would ever attempt. He had cut off every escape route. There was no retreat, no hope. For a moment, the men of Judah must have felt the weight of fear pressing down on them. They had heard the stories. They knew what Jeroboam was capable of. This was going to be a massacre. But then, something happened, something that defied all logic, all military strategy, all human expectation. In that moment of desperation, Abijah and his men did not panic. They did not surrender. Instead, they did the unthinkable. They cried out to the Lord. It wasn't just a whisper. It wasn't just a silent plea. It was a roar, loud, desperate, unshakable. And the priests, they lifted their trumpets and blew. The sound thundered across the battlefield, shaking the hearts of every man who heard it. And suddenly, the tide turned. The warriors of Israel, who moments before had been certain of their victory, began to falter. Panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. Their movements became chaotic. Their once organized formation shattered. And then Judah charged, a counterattack that should have been impossible, a desperate lunge against an enemy twice their size. But this wasn't just Judah's fight anymore. This was God's battle now. And when God fights for you, the numbers don't matter. The battle was fierce. The ground turned red with blood. But one side had supernatural strength. Jeroboam's men, who had come expecting an easy victory, were cut down one after another. And then the unthinkable happened. Jeroboam's army collapsed. 800,000 warriors had entered the battlefield. But by the time the dust settled, 500,000 of them lay dead. It was one of the most lopsided victories in history. Jeroboam, the man who had led Israel into rebellion, fled for his life. And Abijah, he stood victorious. If this battle had been written in any other history book, Abijah would have been praised as one of the greatest military minds of all time. But this wasn't his victory. This was God's victory. Because Judah was outnumbered. Judah was surrounded. Judah should have been destroyed. But they weren't, because they called on the Lord. And when you call on God, He does the impossible. The effects of this battle were immediate. Jeroboam, the once mighty king of Israel, never recovered from this defeat. His power was broken. His confidence shattered. And Abijah, he secured his throne. For a time, Judah was at peace. But here's where the tragedy begins, because Abijah, for all his faith in that moment, did not remain faithful. Yes, he had cried out to God. Yes, he had trusted in the Lord's power to save Judah. But once the battle was won, he went back to living, as if God didn't matter. The man who had declared that Judah stood with the Lord, the king who had witnessed a supernatural victory, failed to lead his people in true obedience. He won the battle, but he lost the war for his soul. Abijah's story is a warning. It is easy to cry out to God in a moment of crisis. It is easy to trust Him when we are surrounded, when we have no other choice. But what happens after the victory? Do we still follow Him? Do we still trust Him? Or do we return to the same mistakes that led us into trouble in the first place? Abijah's life teaches us that a single moment of faith is not enough, because faith isn't just about winning battles. It's about how you live every day. And that's where Abijah failed. He had the courage to stand against Jeroboam, but he didn't have the discipline to follow God after the war was won. And that ultimately was his downfall. The dust had barely settled from Abijah's greatest victory, the miraculous triumph over Jeroboam and Israel. Judah had been outnumbered 2-1, but God had stepped in and turned the impossible into reality. The people cheered, the enemy retreated, and for a moment it seemed like Judah was on the brink of revival. But victories don't always mean transformation. Abijah had seen the hand of God at work, but he never fully surrendered to him. He had stood on the battlefield declaring that Judah was faithful to the Lord, that they were the rightful heirs of the promise. But what he said and how he lived were two very different things. His reign was not long, only 3 years. But in those 3 years, he struggled, not just against external enemies, but against his own failure to lead his people into true obedience. In the ancient world, kings did not have the luxury of resting after war. Every day was a battle, either against foreign enemies or internal corruption. The war against Israel had weakened Jeroboam, but it had not destroyed him. The northern kingdom still existed, and tensions were far from over. But instead of focusing on strengthening Judah spiritually, Abijah became obsessed with strengthening his own power. The Bible tells us that he expanded his kingdom, capturing cities from Israel. He built alliances, fortified strongholds, and increased Judah's military presence. But what he didn't do was lead his people back to God. The sins that had plagued his father Rehoboam still remained. The high places, the shrines to foreign gods, were still standing. Idolatry still lurked in the corners of Judah's cities, and Abijah did nothing to stop it. He was a king who wanted victory, but not transformation. He wanted God's power without God's presence. And that is a dangerous way to rule. Abijah ruled during a critical moment in Judah's history. The division between the north and the south was still fresh. The scars of his father's failure, Rehoboam's arrogance that had torn the kingdom apart, were still visible. Judah needed a king who would call them back to their foundation, who would restore the devotion to God that David had once instilled. But Abijah wasn't that king. Yes, he had moments where he stood for the truth, moments where he remembered the covenant of God. But moments aren't enough. Faith isn't about the battles we win. It's about the life we live afterward. And Abijah never truly led Judah back to the Lord. The tragedy of Abijah's reign is that he knew the right words. He had boldly stood on the battlefield, calling out Jeroboam's wickedness, reminding Israel that Judah had the temple, the priests, the sacrifices, the true worship of God. But what good is it to know the truth if you don't live it? What good is it to declare faith if your heart is still divided? Abijah's 3-year reign was filled with struggle. He fought to maintain his kingdom. He battled against Israel. He worked to fortify his cities. But he never fought against the real enemy, the idolatry that was corrupting his people. One of the most tragic things about Abijah's reign is what the Bible says about him in 1 Kings 15:3. He committed all the sins his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his forefather, had been. He followed in Rehoboam's footsteps. He continued in the very sins that had weakened Judah in the first place. He had seen God's power firsthand. He had watched the Lord destroy Jeroboam's army in a single day. But still, his heart was divided. And because of that, his reign was short, 3 years. That's all he had, 3 years to make a difference, 3 years to call Judah back to faithfulness, 3 years to change the trajectory of a broken kingdom. But instead of being a king who restored Judah, he was a king who barely made an impact. When his time was over, there were no great reforms to speak of, no spiritual renewal, no lasting legacy, only a brief reign filled with war, political struggle, and missed opportunities. And when he died, he was replaced by his son, Asa, a king who would do what Abijah never did, turn Judah back to God. Abijah's story is a warning to all of us. It is possible to stand for truth in one moment and still walk away from God in the next. It is possible to trust Him when we're in trouble, but forget Him when things settle down. Abijah shows us that God doesn't just want us to call on Him in battle. He wants our hearts in everyday life. And if we don't give Him that, then our victories will be meaningless, because God is not looking for people who win battles. He is looking for people who remain faithful. The reign of King Abijah was over almost as soon as it had begun, 3 short years. That was all he had, 3 years to make his mark, 3 years to leave a legacy that would shape the future of Judah. But what did he truly accomplish? He had won a miraculous victory against Jeroboam and Israel, a battle no one thought he could win. But victories, no matter how impressive, do not define a king. His father, Rehoboam, had ruled for 17 years, a reign marked by arrogance, division, and failure. And now Abijah followed in his footsteps, not by lengthening his reign, but by repeating the same mistakes. He had seen what unchecked pride had done to his father. He had witnessed how Israel had split in two because of one reckless decision, and yet he did not change course. And so his rule was cut short. But his death was more than the passing of a king. It was the end of a man who could have done so much more. From the moment he took the throne, Abijah was in a battle, not just a physical war against Israel, but a spiritual war for the heart of Judah. He had the blood of David running through his veins. He had seen God's power in action, delivering him from Jeroboam's overwhelming army. And yet his heart was never fully devoted to the Lord. His father, Rehoboam, had led Judah into idolatry, worshipping false gods, building high places, turning away from the covenant of the Lord. Abijah had the chance to change all of that, to tear down the idols, to restore true worship in Judah, to bring the people back to the God of David. But he didn't. Instead, he let the sins of his father continue. He let idolatry thrive in Judah, and in the end, it consumed him. The Bible says in 1 Kings 15:3, he committed all the sins his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his forefather had been. This was his legacy, not a brought revival, not a king who led his people back to God, but a king who had a moment of faith, but not a life of it. Abijah's death was not one that inspired legends. There was no grand farewell, no prophetic message of hope, no lasting legacy of righteousness. He simply died, and his son Asa took his place. The Bible does not record the details of his final days. Did he die from illness? Was he taken by an unexpected tragedy? We do not know. But what we do know is this: his reign did not bring lasting change. His father had ruled for 17 years. His son Asa would reign for 41 years. Abijah, 3 years of war, 3 years of struggle, 3 years of refusing to lead Judah back to God, and then he was gone. The saddest part of Abijah's life isn't just that he died young. It's that his heart was divided. He had moments of boldness. He had moments of faith. But he never fully gave himself to God, and that is why his legacy faded so quickly. We don't remember Abijah as one of Judah's great kings. We don't see him celebrated for his wisdom, his leadership, or his devotion. He had a powerful speech on the battlefield, but one speech does not define a man. A life does, and Abijah's life was not one of faithfulness. After Abijah's death, his son Asa became king, and Asa was everything that Abijah was not. Where Abijah allowed idolatry, Asa destroyed the idols. Where Abijah followed his father's sins, Asa broke free from them. Where Abijah had a divided heart, Asa was fully devoted to the Lord. And because of that, his reign lasted. Abijah's rule was a warning that knowing about God is not enough, that having faith in one moment does not replace a lifetime of obedience, that if your heart is divided, your kingdom will be weak, and in the end, your legacy will not last. If there's one thing we can learn from Abijah, it's this: God doesn't just want a moment of faith. He wants a lifetime of it. Abijah knew the history of Judah. He knew the story of David. He knew the promise God had made to his family, but knowing something and living it are two different things. And because he never fully lived for God, his story ended before it truly began. If you were to die today, what would your legacy be? Would it be like David's, a life of passion, worship, and faithfulness? Would it be like Asa's, dedicated to restoring righteousness? Or would it be like Abijah's, a name barely remembered, a life that could have been so much more, but was cut short? Abijah had every opportunity to be great. He was the grandson of Solomon, the great-grandson of David, and he stood on the throne of Judah with a chance to restore what his father Rehoboam had lost. But instead of building, he maintained. Instead of leading, he followed. Instead of seeking God fully, he divided his heart. Yes, he won a battle against Jeroboam. Yes, he called on God in a moment of crisis. But faith isn't just about moments. It's about a lifetime. And Abijah never fully committed. His reign was short, turbulent, and ultimately forgettable. He had victory in war, yet failure in leadership. He had the throne, but he never had the devotion of his people or of God. And so his time ended, and his name faded into history. In the next video we'll cover King Asa, the son who had to fix what Abijah left behind. Will Asa repeat his father's mistakes, or will he choose a different path? Like and subscribe for more powerful Bible studies. Till the next video, stay blessed.